Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ann Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies weekly lecture series. My name is Joanna Krongold, and together with Naomi Seidman, I am the instructor of the graduate seminar here at the Center for Jewish Studies. And today I'm really excited to introduce Professor Jodi Eichler-Levine. Professor Eichler-Levine is the Philip and Muriel Berman Professor of Jewish Civilization and a professor of religion studies at Lehigh University. Her first book, Suffer the Little Children, Uses of the Past in Jewish and African American Children's Literature, was published in 2013. And as I was just telling Professor Eichler-Levine, was really a formative work for me as I pursued my studies. She's also the author of Painted Pomegranates and Needlepoint Rabbis, How Jews Craft Resilience and Create Community, which was just published last year in 2020. Professor Eichler-Levine's work at the intersections of religion, Jewish studies, and popular culture has appeared in the Washington Post, Salon, The Revealer, Religion Dispatches, and Killing the Buddha, among other venues. Before I hand over the floor to Professor Eichler-Levine, I just want to go over very briefly the format for today's lecture. So we are going to be hearing from Professor Eichler-Levine in just one moment, after which we'll have a 2-minute break, just a short break for everybody to gather their thoughts. And then after that, we'll commence our Q&A question period with Professor Eichler-Levine. As many of you know, this lecture is part of the CJS graduate seminar. Our students are just in the other room there from me, so I'm going to dash over there and we will begin our conversation firstly with questions from students in our class. For those of you who are tuning in from home, you probably know the drill by now, but if you're a student in the Ann Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies, please type your question into the chat and preface it with CJS student, and we'll be sure to call on you. For those of us who are joining us from the public, please feel free to enter your questions into the chat, and if there's time after the student conversation, hopefully we'll be able to get to all of them. So I think that's all that needs to be said from me, other than to extend a very warm welcome to Professor Eichler-Levine on behalf of the students and the community here at the University of Toronto and the Ann Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies. Professor Eichler-Levine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krungold, for that lovely introduction. And thank you all. I'm so delighted to be here virtually at the Ann Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies. I love Toronto. It's one of my favorite cities. So hello, Toronto. And I also want to be sure to thank Lauren Fidua, Dr. Michael Rosenthal, the director, and Dr. Naomi Seidman for inviting me today. I'm really excited to be with all of you, and I'm going to get some screen sharing started so that you can see what I'm talking about. My talk today is called The Fabric of Forever, Crafting Jewish Memory, and it's based on a combination of things. So I'm trying out some ideas from the book and also some new ideas and interweaving the personal and the academic as I tend to do. I'm really looking forward to our conversation after the talk. Inheritances come with a mandate. In April 2017, I flew to Los Angeles for a week of interviews with members of the Pomegranate Guild of Judaic Needlework, a North American organization of Jewish crafters that has existed for over 40 years. Gertrude, an octogenarian who prefers to sew by hand, sat in her sunny yellow living room, feeding me Passover treats and showing me her creations as her dog hovered protectively over us. Towards the end of our interview, she got to the heart of the matter. It's like a continuous thread, she told me. It's a different way of leaving behind for the future generations the works of your hand, your heart, and your mind. To me, that's what it is, you know. Because look, I'm going to be 88 in a few months. I have all this for people to talk about because they'll be using it. They are using it now. They're talking about it now, the pieces that I made for them. Objects are one of the many things that so many of us hope to leave behind, to capture small essences of our being. Like Gertrude's words, and in part precisely because of her words, the book I ultimately wrote is saturated with mortality. From 2016 to 2019, I researched my book, Painted Pomegranates and Needlepoint Rabbis. I wanted to understand Jewish life in a new way by focusing on the creation of art and craft. These practices constitute a Judaism that is in progress, always becoming a kind of Judaism that is more of a horizon than a container. Today, I'll give you some background on the book and its methodology, explain how my own story became entangled with it during the process of research and writing, and introduce you to a few more examples. I'll also be extending into the book's afterlife and some further reflections and questions on Jewish history and memory. This talk is based on both the book and a much more recent piece about Jewish objects and pathologies that appeared in the journal Cross Currents earlier this year. So a little bit about the book and its methodology. First of all, I always think it's important to credit the amazing artist whose work appears on the cover. At the upper left, Amanda Ford of Maryland created a Torah cover called Anochi, I Am, and she's building in a very midrashic way off of the burning bush story in the book of Exodus. And at the bottom right, you can see the pomegranate design that gets lifted up above the title by Arlene Diane Spector, APAS president of the Pomegranate Guild of Judaic Needlework. So how did I write this book? Well, I had Grover to help me. That was the most important research assistant. The work began before 2016, actually back in 2007. I started to think about a book on religion and craft. And so for several years, it was germinating in the background of other projects, and I was doing some background research. But the work really started in earnest once I came to Lehigh University in 2016. I came here in 2015. In 2016, I did a qualitative survey with over 300 respondents on Jewishness and creativity. So it was even broader than ends up in the book. And I also began my earliest interviews and did a lot of research on craft blogs. The bulk of the work, the research and writing happened in 2017 to 2018. So that was a lot of participant observation. And that's where Grover is. Grover was with me at a craft convention, and he's overseeing my knitting there. And I did the bulk of over 30 interviews from 2017 to 2018, with a few before and after that year. So these are long form interviews, a little bit like oral histories. One of the main sites of my research was the aforementioned Pomegranate Guild of Judaic Needlework. I don't give their history in detail today, but some of it's in the book. Some of it I hope to write more about in the future. And they're a fascinating women-led, although not women exclusive, organization that began in 1977 in Long Island. I also spent about 2 years with a synagogue knitting circle here in Pennsylvania. And so I basically sat in with them, went every month that I could to their monthly meetings, and got to know those ladies pretty well. So I was seeing the work of art and craft on the ground, through interviews all over the country, and in a lot of other ways. So ethnography is a really interpersonal process. It's a series of encounters as we stumble towards a more nuanced understanding of the world around us. When I went into these spaces, like the Pomegranate Guild, like the Knitting Circle, I wasn't just a professor doing research. I was also a Jewish American woman in my late 30s and then in my early 40s. I was a liberal, practicing Ashkenazi Jew who hailed from the Northeast with a long stint in the Midwest, and a mother. I was also not the only one asking questions. Throughout the years that I worked on this book, interviewees always queried me about my own craft practice, and frequently about my young daughter. They asked me about my Jewish background, my academic work, and of course, that's what brought me to their doors. I disclosed many careful tidbits as openly as I could in this ethnographic give and take. In these conversations, I felt a strong sense of identity layering, of how my value in these homes signified something more than just a person who wanted to touch eyes and hear stories. My presence as an ethnographer was one way of preserving these objects and stories for posterity. But I was keenly aware that when it came to those interviewees who were older than me, which was the majority of my subjects, I was also of interest to them precisely because I am a younger Jewish woman who knits, embroiders, and crochets. I was someone who they hoped could become a bearer of memory, not just in words, but also in thread. Age matters a great deal. 4 decades ago, anthropologist Barbara MYERHOFF, featured here, conducted years of groundbreaking fieldwork with the elderly residents of Venice, California. Not all of the crafters portrayed in my work are senior citizens, but a lot were. I have frequently found myself turning to MYERHOFF over the course of this project. Like me, at the time of her research, she was a middle-aged Ashkenazi Jewish woman interacting with Ashkenazi Jews of an older generation who found her Jewish identity of interest. In one of her opening anecdotes, a woman named Basha asks her, "Are you Jewish? Are you married? You got children? Are you teaching them to be Jews?" "I'm trying," MYERHOFF replies. MYERHOFF was speaking primarily with Holocaust survivors, so people born before World War II, and their contemporaries. In my own work, I have talked with a large number of women of her generation, the baby boomers. Had she lived and not died of cancer in 1985, she too would now be a senior citizen. As Rivelin Prell evocatively writes, MYERHOFF drew a direct connection between her embodied self and the people she studied. Quote, "Anthropologist Barbara MYERHOFF looked at the camera in her documentary film Number Our Days and explained, 'Someday, I will be a little old Jewish lady.' Alas, this did not come to pass." Like MYERHOFF, I am keenly aware of my position in studying a group so close to my own experience. I have wondered, like her, how much of my work is a kind of personal quest. Writing decades after groundbreaking works of feminist anthropology that changed the researcher's place in the text from a disembodied voice character within the story, I have been directly influenced by the reflexive ethnographic turn. I'm still puzzling what to make over the overlaps. And that's evident throughout both my project and its afterlife. It's not a memoir, but it does contain some of my own stories within its pages. Here's where that story gets complicated. In April 2018, I had already conducted the bulk of my research on the book. I was thinking a lot about mortality, about the ways that interviewees like Gertrude hoped that their handcrafts would outlive them after they were gone. Suddenly, I brushed up against my own potential expiration date. 6 days before my 40th birthday, I stared at a kind doctor's navy and white patterned dress shirt as I heard the words mucinous adenocarcinoma. After an emergency surgery, weeks of waiting, and 2 different pathology reads of a massive cyst, I learned I had cancer of undetermined origin. A few weeks later, we learned that it was stage 4 colon cancer that had metastasized to my ovaries. I spent the next year writing the book and surviving the cancer in tandem. Terrified of what would happen to the stories transcribed on my computer if I didn't manage to finish the book, I found myself writing feverishly, sending out the book proposal in between surgical consults and scans. Suddenly, my relationship with my informants was changed, as many of them learned about the diagnosis. I had to explain various delays with the book and my absence from the Pennsylvania knitting circle. In the case of those knitters, I became a recipient of the kind of care that was central to the mission of the group. That group had been founded to create lap blankets and shawls for chemotherapy patients at local hospitals. Uncannily, I was working on the blanket for chemotherapy patients as part of work with the group when I became a chemotherapy patient myself. So perhaps I should not have been surprised when I received a box from them while I was recovering from my largest surgery. It was a bright red shawl and cap. Receiving that shawl and many other handmade gifts from friends and family, my understanding of how gifts function, part of my study. 2 years before a pandemic forced millions of people into lockdown, restricting how we relate to the bodies of other humans, I saw how the gift of stitches linked me to networks of care when I was physically isolated due to illness. I also saw the blanket that I had been knitting as part of the group's mission in a new light. I had begun it before, thinking of it as a tzedakah or charity project as these knitters did their blankets. However, it also became an object of comfort for me throughout my medical journey. It even came with me to the hospital. That fall, when it was finally finished, I brought it into the group, giving up the object into which I had stitched so many memories. And now a little bit about Har Vaqui. In her 1979 classic, The Art of Judaic Needlework, Ida Aber places the narrative origins of Jewish fabric arts in assorted biblical texts, including the story of Bezalel and the creation of the tabernacle, as described in the book of Exodus. She writes, "From this, we know that the plastic and graphic artist held a singular position in the Jewish community. What is most extraordinary is that while the people of Israel were still in the desert," she tells us, "they prepared all of the materials for the making of the tabernacle. They were even asked to stop because too much had been prepared." So like the Energizer Bunny of the 1980s, they just kept going and going and going. It's telling, even amidst the privations of the desert, Israelites were ever the overachievers, carrying more raiment and adornments than necessary. What does material abundance mean in relationship to Jewish creativity? I thought of Aber's interpretation of the Israelites when I spoke with artist and art professor Laurel Robinson about the notion of Har Vaqui. At the time of my research, Robinson was a Georgia-based painter and woodcarver. Referring to her own work in contrast with another creative Jew who she said had a very Zen aesthetic, a very minimalist aesthetic, Robinson told me, "Jews don't need that. We're all full of Har Vaqui. I have Har Vaqui, the fear of empty spaces, supremely. I do not like empty places. I like it all cluttered with as much junk in it as possible." And I think Jews are, part of the slam of Jewish art is that it's bad because it's Har Vaqui. It's like folk art. It's like Har Vaqui. No, Har Vaqui is great. I think it is why we have Talmud pages, pictured here at the top, printed, designed in a particular complex way, with commentary on the border and then drawings on the outside of the margins, because we're perfectly capable as a group of people of isolating an interesting tidbit in the midst of chaos. And you can see here a lot of different artists, just a really small sampling of the artists I work with. When I returned to my office after this trip to Georgia, I found myself thinking about Robinson's words in relationship to so many of the homes I have visited in the course of writing the book. These homes were filled with stuff, literal piles upon piles of quilted challah covers, woven prayer shawls, crocheted kippot, holiday decorations, and the raw materials needed to create them. To have too much stuff is an act of class privilege. To create for some is to fight against empty spaces by filling them up. Har Vaqui is Latin for the literal fear of a vacuum, the fear of white empty spaces on a canvas or a computer screen, accompanied by the attendant desire to fill that void with color, light, and chaos. In the history of art criticism, the term goes in response to and critique of the Victorian age of hyper-adornment. Thinking with horror vacui helps us to shed new light on the ethnizing and gendering of Jewish art, craft, and bodies. Jews, particularly Jewish women, have often been understood and stereotyped in relationship to excess and abundance. This brushes up against the way that gender and stuff are intertwined. In both European and American history, Jewish women's bodies were often derided as simply too much, too large, too loud, too uncouth. Jewish noses, of course, were also too much. Jewish mothers served too much food. Robinson aptly connected this with denigrations of Jewish art as also too much, too folk, too filled with images, ironically, given the fact that Jewish tradition is also, at times, misunderstood as entirely aniconic, lacking in white space. Laurel saw that Jewish art was sometimes seen as being what my own mother, an avid collector of objects, would call ungepatchket, a Yiddish word for that which is excessively elaborate, overly decorated. I think about Robinson and horror vacui in concert with the story of Bezalel and friends wandering in the desert, somehow making too much art for the tabernacle even in the midst of vast, sun-bleached emptiness. What would it mean to lean into this excess of creation and of holding on to creations, this drive to fill the void of empty spaces with luminous, bedazzled materiality? What would it mean to embrace excess rather than to try to shrink oneself into a smaller space, which is what's going on in this handkerchief by Heather Arak Kanofsky and her grandmother, Muriel Kamens Lefkowitz. The full story is in the book, but it's a story about Heather calling her grandmother fat in a way that was tremendously hurtful when she was a young child, and then making a piece of art, almost an apology, that reclaimed larger Jewish women's bodies, like this very round one on the right and an inexplicable snowman, also round, with the language "fat is good," which her grandmother then embroidered, and it became a family heir. For those Jewish women who can afford to do so, acquiring things and making even more things with their hands is also a way of claiming space that they are not supposed to take up, of embracing the capaciousness for which they are typically mocked. Now, my own relationship to stuff is complex. In the book, I write about some of my own family's objects and about how some generations of the women in my family discarded items while others held on to them too tightly. I fear too much stuff in my own life, and yet I choose to fall into the challenging role of the scholar, someone sifting through and cataloging and analyzing mountains and mountains of stuff, memories upon memories. And I know those of you in the seminar read some Yerushalmi for today, and I'm thinking here of the end of that chapter of the man in the Borges short story who remembers too much, where everything is there, is present. And this challenging task of the historian or of the person remembering to confront this endless array of memory. To fear a vacuum, to fill it up before it can be filled up by something else, is a way of exerting control. And this image before you, for which I neglected to have a caption, is from the Heavenly Bodies exhibit that was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2018. It's by the French couture artist Gautier, and it's called Echodo, building on the Catholic tradition of bringing objects as part of a prayer, often a prayer for assistance. And so it's the materialized nature of longings, often longings for health, that become part of this garment, different body parts interwoven into the garment. As a cancer patient, I learned to fear empty places and what could encroach upon them in a new way. I had never understood the abdominal cavity as a true cavity before. It had always seemed it was filled with organs. Yet cancer found the empty spaces, filling them up with its metastatic orgy of acquisition. Bonnie VORSPAN, the wife of a rabbi and a past president of the Pomegranate Guild, told me how people would constantly bring them Judaic objects from the homes of deceased relatives or friends. So the attempt to fill up the empty spaces can also overflow. She was the custodian of both her own family's objects and items that other families had cast aside. They don't necessarily want a Jewish thing, she told me. I mean, we have a Moses statue upstairs. I don't know what to do with it, but we're saving it there because there wasn't anybody to take it. We have Chagall windows, the little frame things. We have prayer books that belong to somebody, but those people now are not so Jewish and they really don't care about the prayer books. I get dizzy just rereading this list, mourning, but also aghast at these orphan objects, as if they were animate, like the toys that gather dust and mourn when they are shelved in the Toy Story franchise. I pictured tattered prayer books with little cartoon faces. They weep in the corner of a dark attic. Bonnie explained that because of what she has seen, she now tries to create flat things, more easily stored, more easily kept. She emphasized utility. Quote, "We see this more and more, so that it's very important for me at this point to be able to create heirlooms that our children and our grandchildren will want to use. I think that being able to do it through stitchery is very satisfying for me. I love to be able to feel the fabric, how the threads feel on the fabric. It's very tactile in that regard." In addition to crafting, Bonnie is an avid genealogist. She created pillowcases for baby namings, which you can see here on the right, from heirloom family fabrics, sometimes fabrics that had traveled quite a great distance. She stitched delicate family trees. For Bonnie, careful cataloging is key. But what happens when we lose control over the objects in our lives? What happens to memory then, to objects and body parts we can no longer access? A little bit about pathology's past. In December 2020, so quite recently, in the midst of the pandemic, I read Laura Levitt's new book, The Objects That Remain, a powerful work of creative nonfiction centered on questions of objects, evidence, and trauma. Levitt is a mentor and a friend, and my own writing has been influenced by hers for many, many years. I was curled up on the couch where I had recuperated from so many surgeries as her poignant recollections evoked vivid memories of my own. Throughout the book, Levitt describes her complex relationship with memories of objects from the night she was raped in 1989. She writes of official documents, police reports with errors, inventory lists, a photograph of the sweatpants she was wearing that night, pictured on the floor of her bedroom. The rape kit and objects taken from her home as evidence are now missing, no longer accessible to her, lost somewhere in a police storage room. She can never touch the sweatpants again. In chapter 2, she describes the experience of requesting police information from her case over 20 years later. She quotes the supplementary offense report from one officer, the bureaucratic language used to render her case inactive. The officer wrote, "My investigation has not produced evidence to identify a suspect in this case." At this point, I had to stop reading and put the book down, not just because it is such a painful story, but because it was so familiar. Cancer is obviously not the same as rape. Yet I had gone through a process like this one, reading the intimate traumatic story of my body in a cold bureaucratic document. As I read Laura's words, I could see and remember the words that began the pathology report. Quote, "The specimen is received in formalin." Much like Levitt, I find that my memories become hazy here. Which pathology report? There were 3 different reads of the first tumor alone. Then there's a much longer one with details on all the organs that were removed during my second surgery. I remember the first frantic week after my diagnosis, trying to transfer the slides from my local healthcare system to Memorial Sloan Kettering, the endless phone calls and loops of bureaucracy. Finally, I reached an actual person on the phone, someone who worked in slide storage. These are pathology slides, slices of tumors. And she worked at our local hospital. Quote, "I just packed those up," she said when I told her my name. "They're on their way." And I realized starkly that part of my body, my ovary and the massive growth that encased it and twisted it around, was now truly outside of my body. I had worried that it was missing, inaccessible to me, lost, along with all of the genomic data that it held. Now it was wending its way across the Hudson River in a box, carrying strange portents. Reading the report on what was once a part of your body was an experience of profound displacement. These reports, like Laura's, are also sometimes strangely rich with sensory qualities. Mine said that the surfaces of the ovary remnants were glistening. I knew the word without even having to dig up the file. In the report from my second surgery, which I can access easily online, here is the description of my resected colon, which begins, "The specimen is received fresh and is labeled rectosigmoid." I know you guys were not expecting like colon descriptions today. "The serosal surface is pink tan, smooth and glistening," writes the pathologist later on. Trust me, this connects to Yerushalmi. Every time I read this detached yet uncannily colorful, sensuous prose, I think about stitching. I picture the brilliant shining colors of embroidery silk. Quote, "Make pomegranates of blue and purple and scarlet yarns all around the hem and bells of gold between them all around." Exodus 28:33. This ancient do-it-yourself guide, call it How to Make the Priestly Vestments, inspired the name of the Pomegranate Guild. The lengthy instructions are as specific and detailed as medical descriptions. Most of the biblical texts about or by the priestly folks are written with this level of detail. Many of my colleagues from across different religious traditions, scholars of different times and places in the world, could tell you things about priesthoods and medicine in all of these religious cultures. I'm stuck instead on the uncanny aesthetic of it all, and also the irony. Pomegranates are fertility symbols, a gorgeous red plant ovary filled with juicy edible seeds. Did my ovary engorged with cancer glisten like a pomegranate while I was writing about embroidered pomegranates? My mind spins, but I'll never know for sure. Levitt's objects are lost, their chain of custody broken. But as she writes so evocatively, the memory of these tainted objects lingers. Parts of my body have been removed forever. They are not lost precisely, but they are still gone. Why do I wonder what exactly has become of them? Why do I reread old reports as if they were tea leaves that could predict my future? I consented quite willingly to these invasions beneath my skin, these debulkings, these resections. Yet I mourn them, the organs that I never touched or saw. As a patient, I learned that experts have power and no one has full access to their own body. No wonder I clung to my knitting and embroidery hoop so fiercely throughout the whole experience. As a child with trichotillomania, the compulsive pulling out of one's hair, I cast aside my dead hair cells, which were primarily ornamental, certainly doing no harm. Now, I sometimes wish I could reclaim the organs whose cells mutated and tried to kill me. I want to save those specimens, hoard them, put them in a jar on my bookshelf to remember. The fabric of forever. The crafting of Judaism is a continuous making and unmaking, one that sustains, even when covered in wine stains, from generation to generation. When I set out to write my book, one of my biggest goals was to attend to older Jewish women's voices, the sorts of voices often missing from Jewish life. MYERHOFF's Number Our Days remains one of the most significant books to pay close attention to the dimension of age in the field of Jewish studies, and many of her observations remain helpful. She calls the women of the center where she did her work bricoleurs, parlaying bits of culture and different activities together, able to devise entire miniature worlds in her home. For the women of the Pomegranate Guild, these worlds of creation sometimes became exterior, jutting out into the collective gatherings of their conventions and public exhibitions. But these generative universes retain a strong domestic and everyday component. For MYERHOFF, the power of such women resides precisely in the everyday. Because their tasks are particularized, concrete, embedded, and subjective, there is less urgency, not to mention little opportunity, to make them into platforms, public festivals, ideological treatises. They are known as part of living rather than discussions about living, and their very form makes it an inconsistency to formulate them as enduring collective principles. These understandings are a kind of underground culture, quietly transmitted in situations no less essential than the starkly evident, grandiose cultural productions we customarily attend. The underground culture of crafting, which is both a big business, a very profitable business, the crafting industry, and an intimate production, continues this thread of literal and metaphorical bricolage. When my informants want Jewish stitching to continue, they are saying that these subtle cultures, these hours of careful creation that rarely get the attention of a High Holy Day sermon or a viral op-ed, must endure. In California, Zelda, an octogenarian sewer, put it this way as she summed up what she loves about stitching. It's very fulfilling. I love it. I feel a connection to the past. I feel that I'm in some way opening a road to the future with it. My children have all these things. They will remember me doing what I made. And it's a very sacred part of my life, really. You could see I do a lot of Jewish things. That way, I'm very, very Orthodox. The sacred happens, I think, where people say that it happens. Zelda played upon the word Orthodox, on her own perception of Jewish observance, which, like the practice of most Jewish Americans, does not adhere to all of the classical elements of Jewish law or include large amounts of public prayer. In a Protestant-dominated culture, belief has become the most important aspect of religion to some Jews too. Rather than belief or practice, she says, what makes her quite playfully Orthodox is her devotion to Jewish objects, and most crucially, to objects at the fulcrum of multiple generations. Zelda's objects connect her to the past and to the future, providing a form of Jewish continuity that is sutured to the life of her family and with how she wants to be remembered. Stitching, like writing and religion, is a place where we encounter mortality. In the paper Pomegranate of September 1981, Faith Feldman Cohn writes, quote, to many people, men and women, pushing a needle in and yanking it out of material is just that. To us as needle women, it's a stitch taken in the fabric of forever. To stitch is to take part in an act of faith that says not only will you finish the stitching project, but also that the item may have a life after you are gone. Someone will save it. Someone will use it. Someone will remember that you made it. Or will they? Our looming worldwide environmental catastrophe makes me think of the thousands of textiles lost in the Holocaust, the ones that many of my interviewees wanted to replace. But on a global scale, I see a vision of a world without recipients to inherit these heirlooms. It makes me marvel even more deeply at this powerful will to continue creating. Pathology, from pathos. Pathology, noun. Senses to do with feelings, says section 1 of the entry in the Oxford English Dictionary. 1.2, quote, the branch of knowledge that deals with the emotions, obsolete, rare. 2, senses to do with disease or abnormality. These are some words from the Oxford English Dictionary. Soft, scratchy, supple, joyous, fearful, content. As I wrote this book, I bumped up against the other kind of pathology, glistening, clinical, abnormal. Pathos comes from the Greek. It makes us think about feelings, senses, suffering. The art of crafting Judaism and the sciences of bodily suffering meet at this etymological scene. Logos, also Greek, word, logic, reason, branch of knowledge. When knowledge through haptics was cut short, when I couldn't feel my own organs, when my interviewees wondered what would happen if the threads of their lives never met new fingers, we felt alienation, fear, even suffering. We survived by developing new habits that can hold that suffering while providing scraps of solace. And then in all of this, what is the place of the historian vis-a-vis Jewish history, vis-a-vis Jewish memory? This is part of what Yerushalmi is asking at the end of Zachor. Ultimately, he argues, Jewish memory cannot be healed unless the group itself finds healing, unless its wholeness is restored or rejuvenated. But for the wounds inflicted upon Jewish life by the disintegrative blows of the last 200 years, the historian seems at best a pathologist, hardly a physician. And I think this is an open question about both Jewish history and Jewish memory practices. And Yerushalmi is a little bit slippery in this chapter on his position as both a Jewish historian and a historian of Jews. Is the work of history just pathology, trying to classify endless objects and feelings and memories? Or do history, or for that matter, memory, have a reparative property? Are they trying to stitch things back together to make sense, to, as he writes, evoke? Barbara Myerhoff wrote that among the community members in Venice Beach, the opposite of honor was not shame, but invisibility. This holds true for crafting. It doesn't matter if the work is a prize winner or someone's kitschy, over-the-top first quilt with uneven seams. The point of these works is that they must be seen, touched, smelled, have wine spilled upon them over dinner. To create, to be remembered. Remembrance is a signpost of resilience. I was here, animated by a stitch taken in the fabric of forever, by a hand that survived illness, the death of loved ones, the tumult of life, the stitches suggest. Crafting makes many kinds of Judaisms visible, lifting the quotidian to the realm of something that might not be eternal, who can say that, but that can extend us beyond the fragile boundaries of our own skin. Thank you.